Voice, I'm hoping it'll hang on tonight. Acts chapter 18. Acts 18, we'll pick up in verse 7 where we left off last week. Just as a reminder, I'm going to back up and read a few verses here. This is verse 5, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit, testify to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, "Your blood be upon your own heads, I am clean. From now on I will go on to the Gentiles." And so our last slide made the point. He's on to the Gentiles. And this has been typical of the work of the Apostle Paul. He goes first, if there is a synagogue, that's where he would go. He would have a ready audience, so to speak. He would begin to preach there. And according to Romans chapter 2, the advantage that the Jew had was the fact that they had the Scriptures. And so they had that background, they had that knowledge, they had that information leading them to the Christ. Galatians chapter 3, 19 through 24. And so he would go clearly to the Jews first and also then to the Greek. And so, but in this case, they opposed themselves. They were not, we talked about the fact that they were not honest with the truth. They were not honest with themselves. Hence the phrase, they opposed themselves. And of course, they were standing up against Paul and his teaching. But Paul would move on from the Jews at this point who had rejected him. Verse 7 says, he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus. The ASV says, or calls him Titus Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. And most translations have that it was either hard fast to the synagogue. It was literally practically attached to it. And so he would open up his home to the Apostle Paul and those preaching the gospel for the opportunity to worship, for the opportunity to preach and teach the gospel of Christ. And so his door became open. It was right there, certainly right next to the synagogue. And so it would have been very clear what was going on, very obvious who had opened up his house. They know him very well. And so even though we know very little about Titus Justus, we're told a couple of things. The fact that he was a worshiper of God, but his name indicates that he was a Gentile. And so he was likely then a proselyte to the Jews' religion, and now he favorably listened to what Paul had stated and opened his door, and a door of opportunity. And so sometimes that seems to be the case. Sometimes there's a door that closes and yet another one seems to open up. And that's practically what happened here. And so his house was right next to the synagogue, and here is the opportunity where he's going to get to continue to preach. This is not Titus. We've already been introduced to Titus, the minister that we know that looks at the Apostle Paul, as does Timothy, as a father in the faith. And so Titus is already on the scene working and so forth. So this is another, which was obviously a common name. In verse 8, Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Paul's preaching, though rejected of by the Jews, at least some of the Jews, has certainly been bearing some fruit. And so Crispus, who the King James says is the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his house. And so we find that maybe like the household of Cornelius, we have a phrase like that. So many in his house have obeyed the gospel as well. And so he is leading his house, following the gospel of Christ. And then we're told many Corinthians obeyed the gospel. And so they heard the teaching that was being done, they believed it, and were baptized. Crispus would evidently give up his position. It is likely the case that he is replaced by this individual we'll read about in a few minutes, named Sosthenes. He also, it's possible that he becomes the one that we read about later that is converted to Christ. But while to us, Sosthenes is not that common of a name, it was fairly common. And so it could be that this might be a completely different individual who now who leads the charge against Paul before Gallio, and so the proconsul, and then he gets beat. And so there's a lot to come that are going to happen. So, but we might start connecting a few dots here. You have Justus who opens up his home. It gives a great opportunity for the gospel still being preached, and very clearly the gospel still having an influence on those Jews. So much so that the chief ruler of the synagogue obeys the gospel, he and his household. And then we're told many Corinthians hearing, believed, and were baptized. And so obviously there is this was a great influence, a great opportunity to be able to work out of Justus's home and to be able to preach there. Verses 9 and 10, now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak. Do not keep silent. I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. I love this passage because it gives us a picture of a couple of things. Number one, Paul's an apostle of Jesus Christ, right? He himself has been the ruler of a synagogue, and he knows that position very well. And so he has been a ruler, he has been a leader. He was so much of a leader in the Jews' religion that he is the one that they called to put an end to Christianity, and yet that really just fired up the base, so to speak. That fired up Christians. And they went everywhere preaching the word, right? Acts 8 and verse 4. And so then Paul obeys the gospel, and Paul is going to be the apostle to the Gentiles. That's how he's going to be known. There's a great work for him to do, and he is doing it. But then this statement where the Lord speaks to Paul in a vision and says, do not be afraid. Now, what do you get from that when you hear that? That's how I take it. It seems to be implied that there's some fear and some anxiousness on the part of Paul. At the very least, he's anxious about things.
It also shows that Jesus knows what we go through.
There you go. The other side of this is that Jesus knows exactly what we're going through. He knows what Paul is going through. And so he's there, he comforts him. And so the word that we read in 1 John chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, when it talks about, it uses the word advocate there. He is our advocate. If any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. He is an advocate, but literally that word is also translated in other places as comforter. Paraclete is the original word there, and it's translated as comforter. When it speaks of the Holy Spirit, he would be the comforter to the apostles. But this is Jesus speaking to him. And Jesus is our comforter, not the Holy Spirit, by the way. He would be a comforter by the way that he would guide the apostles into all truth, guiding them where they would go. And so certainly would gain comfort from that. But the same word is used. It speaks of Jesus to Christians as he is our comforter. That is, Jesus is our comforter. And we see him comforting. We see the work that he's doing right here with Paul. Knows him very well, knows what he's going through, knows the fact that he is anxious. At minimum, he's anxious. At worst, he is fearful for his life. And so anywhere you might look at that and take a picture there to see where he's at in his mind, Jesus knows, doesn't he? He's right there with him. And he says, don't be fearful. I have many people in this city. Which is also an interesting part of that verse from the standpoint, there have been a lot of people who have taken that out of context. Calvinists who have taken that out of context so as to say, see, God has chosen specifically. These people haven't even obeyed the gospel yet, and God specifically knows exactly who are His, right? This passage is not a reflection of Calvinism and John Calvin's false teaching. This passage simply says the opportunity is there, and what do we read right before this in verse 8? That many Corinthians have already believed, right? And obeyed the gospel. He says, I have many people. And so, as if it has already happened, yes, God does certainly know that. Has He handpicked those certain individuals? That's not at all coming from this verse. That's a man-made doctrine that is there, not a divine doctrine. And so, there have been those who would pervert the gospel of Christ, right? We see that they certainly have done so here with that idea. Paul has come to Corinth. It is a large, large pagan population with little regard for human life, no respect for Christ, no respect for His followers, the people that are given over to lasciviousness, so much so that they become a euphemism to Corinthianize, and that certainly was not a good thing. These people do not fear God, have no concern for this lowly Jew who has come into town preaching this doctrine. And you can understand then maybe a little bit of maybe why Paul might be a little bit anxious and fearful in this work. But he tells him what to do, right? Speak and do not keep silent. I find comfort in that from the standpoint of a gospel preacher. I hope you find comfort in that from the standpoint of a Christian, to be able to not keep silent, but to speak the words of truth. It is that important. People need to hear it. People need to know it. This is the saving gospel that we're talking about. Paul would write in another place, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And Jesus says here, you don't have to be. I'm with you, right? And so this is not the only time that we read verses like that where we see this kind of encouragement. Hebrews 13:5 is the verse that I made mention to. And so the apostles themselves were not immune to being discouraged, being anxious. Does Paul learn anything, you think, from this? From this occasion here? And from what Jesus tells him?
But we see even sometimes that people can lose sight. And by this, it looks like he didn't forget that God was with him, but at the same time, he let worldly things get into his mind. And God's having to remind him, I'm still here, I haven't let you go. No matter what, I'll still be with you.
Yeah,
Don't be scared.
that's a good point. Sometimes it takes us refocusing on the truth, right? So, yes, sir. That's a great point. Brother Raymond makes the point that there's no situation that should cause us to keep silent when we have the truth. Yet there is still a right and wrong way to go about preaching it. So We're aggravating Siri tonight, sounds like. Yes, sir. It's a good point. So how would you approach the work at Corinth? If you're sent to Corinth, you've just left Athens and the sermon that you preached there on Mars Hill. You come into Corinth, you go to the Jews and you preach there, and the Jews reject that message. What's your approach now? You've had a door open of opportunity to go and use Justice's house to be able to preach the gospel from that. Let that be the base of operations. So how are you going to approach the work in Corinth? Anybody? Say it again. Preach to the Gentiles? Yes, sir. He's going to preach to the Gentiles, and there is going to be certainly opportunities for the Jews to continue to hear. So much so that it's going to cause quite the stir among the Jews, and they're going to bring Paul up, try to have him charged with riot and so forth, and such as that. So there's a lot of things that are going to take place. Verse 11, it says, he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. And so 18 months will pass. He's going to be preaching there, doing a great work. We're going to find out, and that seems to be kind of just a summary verse in the middle of that. Just so we know that he continues preaching the word, because we have this vision. Luke records this vision given to Paul by Jesus, saying, do not be afraid, but speak. Don't hold your tongue. Continue to preach. There are many people in this city that I have. And so then we're told by Luke, he continues there for 1.5 years preaching the word of God among them. It doesn't change, does it? The message doesn't change, and really the way that he goes about it. He goes into each city, and if there's a synagogue, he goes there, he goes to the Jews. They should respond the right way, but they don't always do that. They're going to follow him around from city to city, or they have previously, and try to tear down some of that work that he's done. And so they cause quite a stir among the people wherever they are because of the way that he is going about preaching the gospel. All right. I want to read this here in just a moment about what is written about Gallio. Verse 12 and 13 says, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, that's the location where Corinth is, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. And so they rise up against Paul. They bring him before Gallio. Gallio is proconsul around 51 AD, so that gives us a time frame of where we are. And this is a province of which Corinth is the capital. Corinth is the capital of Achaia. The charges that are made are similar to what he has already been brought up on in other chapters. Chapter 16, let's just go back and refresh our memory here. Chapter 16, beginning of verse 20. They brought them to the magistrates and said, these men, being Jews, exceedingly trouble our city, and they teach customs that are not lawful for us, being Romans, to receive or observe. Then the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates tore off their clothes and commanded them to be beaten with rods. And when they had laid many stripes on them, threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. And then you go to chapter 17, drop down to verse 5. But the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason, sought to bring them out to the people, but when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the cities, crying out, "These who have turned the world upside down have come here too. Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus." So we see efforts that have been made against Paul, against the preaching of the gospel. And so this is very similar to such. This new religion, they claim, this new religion that's being brought up, it is not recognized here by Roman law. And so one of the things that we might be mindful of is that the Jewish religion was in fact recognized by Roman law as being legitimate, whereas Christianity was not. And so they were trying to use that. And so finally, when the proconsul was available for such matters, the Jews finally had enough. They gather up all their opposition to Paul, and they seize him and bring him before the judgment seat. And their charge was he's attempting to persuade men to worship God contrary to the law. But here the charge is raised by the Jews, asserting that Paul was teaching a new religion, not recognized by, again, the Roman law. And these Jews they're not concerned about Rome's laws, are they? We know that. This is just a way that they could try to twist it enough before the proconsul to maybe get him to act upon Paul and do something with him. Gallio, who is the brother of Seneca. Seneca was the advisor to Nero. That name will ring a bell, right? He would speak about Gallio, and this is what I have from Seneca. "No one of mortals is so pleasant to one person as he is to all." That's quite a statement about a person, isn't it? And basically, he treats everybody the same. I mean, that's the nuts and bolts of it. No one of mortals is so pleasant to one person as he is to all. Conybeare and Hawson, in their commentary, they make this statement. His brother speaks of him with singular affection, not only as a man of integrity and honesty, but as one who won universal regard by his amiable temper, his beautiful temper, in other words, and his popular manners. So he was cordial to everyone, he was friendly to everyone, and so his conduct on the occasion of the uprising at Corinth, they write, is quite in harmony with the character described by Seneca. He didn't allow himself, like Pilate, to be led into injustice by the clamor of the Jews, but yet he overlooked, with easy indifference, it says, an outbreak of violence which a sterner and more imperious governor would have at once arrested. And so they make the point that his character on that day, that's how he was. And so they didn't run roughshod, if you will, over the proconsul, the governor. And so Gallio holds his own against the Jews, is not swayed by them in any way, and so he seems to rule properly on this. And then we read in verse 14, "And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, 'If it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you.'" He didn't even seemingly want to deal with them. He knows and maybe understands already why they're there. How long has Paul been there? About 18 months, right? He's been there a while. And so, certainly, Gallio knows something about Paul. And so, he says, "O Jews," he says, "if there was wicked crimes or wrongdoing that had been done," he said, I would bear with you on this. But if it's a question of words and names and your own law, then handle it yourselves, basically. Look to it yourselves. He says, "I do not want to be a judge of such matters." And he drove them from the judgment seat. Literally, Gallio refused to hear the case, and he tosses them out from the judgment hall. He has them removed from the judgment hall. And so that leads to verse 17. All the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice of these things. So the question is, who beat this man Sosthenes, who was now the ruler of the synagogue? Crispus was, now Sosthenes is. Who took him and beat him? Depending on which translation you read, here it says, all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. When you look at some other manuscript evidence, you find the fact that then they all, then even the crowd. And so it becomes a little less clear maybe when you look at some of the other individuals. And so we kind of have to do a little ciphering to figure this out. But that crowd, that would include Gentile onlookers who were there, who were before the council as well. The Jews certainly would have included them. It would even include court officers, and they were referred to as lictors. And these lictors, what they would have done, they would have been the ones, they were like bodyguards. And so when Gallio dismissed the case and literally has them tossed out, these are the individuals doing the tossing, okay? They toss them out. And so they are attendants of the court. They are the proconsul's bodyguards. And so they are literally the court-appointed officers to handle those matters. And so maybe a couple things are going on here. And you know, again, this is just trying to put a couple of things together to figure out this. I don't think this is a bad translation to say that all the Greeks took Sosthenes and beat him. But I think that probably the manuscript evidence is true. Then they all, even the crowd, did this. But what was likely taking place was that maybe Sosthenes, maybe he's still trying to plead his case. He is the chief ruler, by the way, right? He is the one who is pleading the case. And so maybe while everyone else is getting thrown out, maybe he's still there and he's still trying to, but judge. And they manhandle him, maybe to the ground, and begin to beat him, and then drag him out. At least that's one idea. And there may be others. Some have thought this, many commentators have thought this to be that the Jews actually are the ones who take him and beat him, because maybe he wasn't able to plead the case or something like that. And then the fact that, in fact, Wayne Jackson is one. He says there's no real manuscript evidence for this being Greeks. Specifically, what he's talking about is that the word Greek was not there, that this being Greeks, but that this was even the crowd, as you might see in some of the translations, the ESV, the New American Standard, and so forth. So, again, just to make the point, the crowd would have included Gentiles, it would have included some Jews, it would have included the court officers who were there, and maybe it's the case that they're the ones who actually would take care of Sosthenes, if you will. They beat him. Verse, let's see. You do have mention in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1. You have this name mentioned again, Sosthenes. Paul called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sosthenes our brother. Okay, I don't think it's just coincidental. Maybe it's the case that upon realizing that, hey, this really went south for us, this went sideways for us, however you want to look at that, maybe he takes a long, harder look at this. And again, you could look at this and you say, okay, well, if it's the Jews, then they've turned on their leader. Well, that would lend some credence to maybe causing this man Sosthenes to look further into Christianity and to see something of its merit. If it's just a crowd of Greeks that are there, maybe it's some of those who are anti-Jewish and the Jews have stirred up the court that day. They didn't take kindly to it. They took care of that. And then you have the idea of it being those court-appointed by the proconsul to take care of those matters. And so there's a couple ideas that are floated out there. I take the latter. Just if you want my opinion on it, I believe it to be those court-appointed officers who are doing the beating. Verse 18. So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren, sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow. And so Cenchrea is about 10 miles. That is the southeastern harbor. And so the destination, the final destination, he wanted to go to Antioch of Syria. That's where he's going to give a report. That's where he's been working out of in these missionary journeys. So that's his plan, to go there and to give a report. His journey is going to take him through Ephesus. It's going to take him to Caesarea. He's going to go to Jerusalem for a moment, and then finally to Antioch of Syria. And so just to kind of pick up on a couple things there. What comments or questions do you have so far? I opened up the big book so I could find out. No. Reese's commentary, he's got some pretty good ideas on that. I knew somebody would ask, so I was just opening it up. There it was. Why did Paul take this vow? The short answer is we don't know. We're just not told. There seems to be nothing wrong with him having done so, but we're not told exactly why. But before we get there, you will read that there are those who will make a claim. I don't think there's any real merit to it from the original language. There's certainly no merit to it. But some have said that maybe the way that it's worded a little bit, that this might be Aquila who actually has taken this vow, and spent some time looking at it. I've looked at it a couple other times as well, and sought plenty of commentaries and other writings on it, but it does not indicate that from the Greek grammar. Let's just put it that way. And so, looking at the original, the participles that are in that passage all point to the Apostle Paul, not to Aquila. And because the way that it's worded, Aquila and Priscilla there, the masculine that is used for the participle would not fit a compound subject. And so it is Paul who takes this vow. Now, what kind of vow was it specifically? Because if we could understand what kind of vow it was, that might help us in understanding why he took the vow. So let me float a couple ideas out there for you. I will say that most writers feel that this was probably a Nazirite vow. But we'll talk about what that is here in just a moment, but that's not necessarily the case. But I will tell you that most writers believe it to be a Nazirite vow. In addition to whatever was promised to God, and so there's usually some type of promise made to God, the person taking the vow would then undertake certain restraints on himself, and included, if it were a Nazirite vow, abstinence from anything from the grape. So abstinence from any kind of wine, allowing the hair and beard to grow, not coming in contact with anything dead. And so the length of the vow could be lifelong. It could be 8 days. It could be a month. But if it were a temporary Nazirite vow, when the time of the vow expired, typically then what was done, the hair was shaved off, but it was done so by a priest. And so, hence going to Jerusalem, there at the temple, having his head shaved, and then that hair would be literally burnt as part of a burnt offering there on the altar, along with the sacrifice of a male lamb for a burnt offering, as well as a female lamb for expiatory sacrifice, and also a ram for a peace offering. And so there was quite a lot that was involved with that, if it is the Nazirite vow. 5 minutes. Samson had done that, yes. And so that's where we know that phrase. There were others as well.
We see any Jews teach that shows that Paul was still a Jew, and that it justifies their retaining the law. Even though they believe Jesus is the Messiah, they're going to remain Jewish Christians.
Yeah. And while Paul certainly kept some things that were not necessarily bound, I don't know that he necessarily believed them to be bound by law anymore, because he understood the new covenant versus old. And that's where we would differ with such thoughts as that. Here's some other thoughts, though. Paul, he makes a statement, by the way, to the Corinthian church. I'm going to paraphrase, but he basically says, I've become all things to all men that I might win some, right? What is his point?
I would understand him to mean, I will become all things that are possible for a Christian to become when we're teaching the law.
Yeah.
Paul's going to follow the law.
Yeah.
Anything to follow it, he's selected by Christ.
Right. Absolutely. So he is going to, in becoming all things to all men, so he explains in that letter, I think it's 1 Corinthians 9, by the way, where that verse is, maybe verse 20, somewhere along in there. Anyway, he says to the Jews, I became, what? A Jew. So here is a situation where at least some have suggested that Paul loved the Jews so much that by taking this vow, that it would have been, they would have seen it as a holy thing, but it would have given them opportunity. And so in order that he might win the Jews. Another example, verse 14, I think is what I was looking for a moment ago. 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 14. I think that has merit in the sense that maybe that's how Sosthenes is won over. And his name there at the first of the letter, 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 1, here's a man who was possibly the ruler of the synagogue, replacing Crispus, who also has obeyed the gospel in his household, is now won to Christ. There is a third suggestion, and that this is not so much a vow of promise as it is a vow of gratitude. And there were vows of gratitude that were done as well. And so maybe this is a vow of gratitude that he was delivered by God from such a dangerous situation. I can see some merit in that, because you have Jesus coming to him by night in a vision, right? And saying, do not be afraid. You go ahead and speak, and do not be silent. You don't have to worry about, they're not going to hurt you. I have many people in this city. And so here's maybe he sees as yet an answer to his prayers. And so maybe he takes a vow of gratitude, and keeping with these vows, it would have been typical then when the vows were done that he would have shaved his head, cut his hair. what you pick up on is that he didn't do it in Corinth. He did it in Cenchrea after he is maybe safely out of Corinth. And so there seems to be some maybe legitimacy to that as well. Yes, sir.
It seems to me that so little is said except he made the vow.
Say it again.
It seems so little is said about what the vow was. It is an example to us that we can make a commitment or a vow to God that we're going to do something for the kingdom, for the Savior. In other words, I don't think the idea of Nazarite vow or anything like that, Paul had left that, that kind of vow. I think he just said, Lord, I am making a vow that I will do these things, and leaves that example for us.
Yeah.
Luke does.
I would agree. I don't think it's a Nazarite vow. I think it's either option 2 or 3, and which I don't know for sure, but anyway, appreciate the comments on that. Yes, sir.
Go back to Numbers chapter 6, read that whole chapter. Speaks of this Nazarite vow.
Yes, sir.
What was connected with it. He said it was a Nazarite vow.
Yeah.
All it took, he was following the instruction over here in the book of Numbers.
Yeah. And there, and number 6 does give the picture of that, and so you can read it and you can make up your own mind as to whether it was a Nazarite vow or just simply a vow of either gratitude or a vow of promise, commitment, whatever it could have been. We're not told, and probably so that we would not sit here and spend all afternoon just talking about that. But anyway, we have to get it out there because there's a lot of ideas floated around out there, right? So anyway, appreciate everyone's attention and comments. Look forward to seeing you on the Lord's Day when we begin our gospel meeting with Brandon Britton. And I've spoken with him. He's looking forward to being here with us. And so I know we'll have a fellowship meal on that day and look forward to that. Sunday night, keep this in mind as well. Shortly after services are through, then we will, whoever wants to, we're going to drive to Cades Cove and loop the cove and spend some time together. So anyway, a lot going on this upcoming weekend. Look forward to seeing you back then.